Hey everybody, how's it going? Now I know in the previous video I mentioned I was going to do one more video on observables, where we create our own subscriptions and our own observables and all that kind of stuff. Then I thought about it and I thought it's really an advanced topic and I don't think there's really much benefit to you guys knowing about it anyway, because most of the time you ain't going to do anything like that. So if you ever want to do it, hit me up, let me know, and I'll produce a video maybe after this Angular course is done on it. So what I'm doing instead is I'm moving on to directives, and more specifically attribute directives, and ones we'll be creating ourselves. Okay, so there are a few directives that we've already looked at in Angular 2, some structural ones, and obviously any components that we've built as well are also known as directives. So this one will be more modifying the behavior of an individual element. So whether it be that we pick an element and we change its color, or we change its size, or we change how it behaves in other ways. That's what the focus of this video is going to be about. Okay, so to get started, I've created basically a new project. I've got the GitHub repo in the description, and we're going to do something called a fancy div. Now, it's not really that fancy, okay, once you see the end result, but it's more just to demonstrate all the kinds of things you can do with a directive, right? So let's get started on it. So we need to actually create a directive first, or at least the skeleton of a directive. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over to my little explorer over here. I'm going to create a new file, and I'm going to call it fancy-div.directive, okay? And it's going to be a TS file. Now, .directive indicates that in fact, it's a attribute directive. It's not a component, it's not a structural directive, it's an attribute directive. Okay, so I'm now going to do that. Now, basically, when we're creating these things, we need to specify an import, and we're going to import something called directive, which is a decorator, like the component decorator, and this is also contained inside of Angular/core. Okay, so nothing special there. So once we do that, we're going to come down to our directive, like that, and like so, inside of here, just like we did for components, we're going to have a selector, and that selector is going to be in square brackets, and this will be the name of our directive that we apply to a specific element on the page, right? So for example, I'm going to call this one fancy div, like so. And then we're going to export a class, and I'll call it fancy div directive, right? And another thing, its convention is that if it's a directive, it usually has a class name that ends with directive. That's just convention. Okay? So far, this directive doesn't really do anything, and that's fine. So what I'll do first is I'll actually make it do something, so that when we load it on the page, we can see it's actually working. So the first thing we need to do is we need to create a constructor. Right? Inside of this constructor, we need to include the element, like so. Now, ElementRef you should have seen in previous videos. So this is also inside of Angular core. So we need to include that. But basically, this is like a reference to the native element that this directive will be applied to. So whatever element has fancy div attribute written on it, it will basically be returned here as a native DOM element, right? So what I'm going to do just to start here, I'm going to go we'll go native element dot style dot background. Now, if you guys don't remember this, go back. I think it might be my 20th tutorial where I'm looking at lifecycle hooks for Vue, the Vue child, the Vue child ones, I believe, after Vue child init and Vue child checked and all that, after Vue checked that particular video, and it had this stuff in it. Okay, so this is nothing that should be new to you if you went through all my videos. And so what I'm going to do here, I'm going to specify the background to be FF. Now we'll go DDD, like so, right? So it's going to be a light grayish color. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab this attribute name. I'm going to come over to my app component where I have the fancy div. And I'm going to apply it here like so. Okay. I'm going to save that. So by rights, based on what we just wrote, right, we should get this div with the background color, it's like a slight grey color. Okay, so let's go and check. And we'll refresh. And nothing happened. And you're like, okay, why did nothing happen? Well, just like a component, a directive also has to be registered with a module. Okay, which we haven't got here. So we need to come down, and under here, I'm just going to reference the fancy div directive like so. And once again, the IntelliSense, I still have not fixed that after so many videos, but you know, I've got better things to do than to worry about IDE stuff. But basically that should now work, and we can see here we do have it working. Not sure what's going on here while we're getting a highlight. Fancy div directive. Okay, something weird is going on here. This is actually further on in the video. Let me pause and find out what happened here. I think it might be caching something. Okay guys, I'm back. So, not sure what happened before, but when I rebooted my, basically my runtime, it came back with the right result this time. I think what happened is when I developed this the first time, it left some of the information behind when I did the ng serve. I think it left some of the JavaScript files from the previous run that I did, and that's why it went yellow and squarish. But this is the behavior I was expecting. So now we've got a light grayish background with inside of a div. So nothing special here so far. Okay. Next thing I want to do is I'm going to add some padding here, and I'm going to put the text in the middle. So let's do that. I'm not going to do that from here, though technically I could. I'm just going to do it inside the CSS file for the moment. So we're div, I'll go padding, 10 pixels, and text align center. Now we could do this inside of the directive, but really this is kind of stuff that's not related to what I'm going to be doing in this video. So now we've got, you know, fancy div in the center and some padding. Now I want to reduce the width of this thing. Alright, so I'm going to come over. I'm not going to update the CSS. This time I want this to be configured. So I want to configure the width of this and the height of this myself, or what I'm going to refer to as the side length. Right. So I'm going to come over to my directive. I'm going to basically, just for starters, I'm going to go el.nativeelement.style.width equals, and we'll say 200 pixels. And we're going to do the same for the height here. Like so. And we'll save that, and now we should get a box that looks like that. That's controlled by the directive, which is pretty cool. Right, so far so good. Now, what I want to do next is I really want to change the behavior of this box when I hover over it. So I might even say, you know, when I hover over this, I want this to turn to a background of yellow, which you would have seen earlier on before, you know, I had to pause the video. You would have seen it go yellow and then have a white or a black piece of text here still. I want to achieve the same thing. So how do I go about doing that with a directive? Well, what we need to introduce to you guys here is something called a host listener. So we need to include that here, host listener. And what this essentially does is it listens for events that are on the particular element that has this directive on it, and basically we can perform actions based on those events. So to do that, it's a decorator. So we come down, I'm going to go at host listener, and what I'm going to look for is mouse over, and it's not on mouse over. Anything Angular 2, it does not have the on in front of it. Okay, it's just mouse over. So even if you were creating an event inside of a component, remember we called it mouse over, not on mouse over. Just a small description there. Even though I'm going to call it on mouse over here, like so. And once again, it keeps doing that. That stupid IntelliSense on mouse over. So what do we want to do on mouse over? What I want to start off doing is I want to resize the size of the element, or the box I should say. And what we might do is we might increment the size of that. So by default, what I'm going to do is I'm going to set a default increment. Alright, so we'll come up and I'll set a private variable. I'll call it size increment, and we'll give it a number, and we'll say it's 100 equals 100, like so. And as a result of that, and in fact we don't need the px here, we just need 200, I believe. Let's just quickly check, see if that still works. It doesn't. We'll put the px back. So what I'm going to do now is I need to include the new value of this. So for the moment, I'm going to leave out this size increment because I'm going to implement this a different way soon. So what I'm going to do is go el.nativeElement.style.width equals, and we'll say, because we want to go by 100, we'll say it's 300 pixels, like so. And it should be this.el. And we'll come down, we'll set the same for the height. So this is what we refer to as very explicit programming. We're explicitly setting things. Now we're going to address how to fix this in a moment and to make it a little bit more flexible, but this is the starting point. So now that I hover over this, we get it to go to 300, but when I hover out, it doesn't go back down to its original size. Okay, so we need to handle this situation. So let's do that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create another host listener. And it'll be on mouse out. We'll go on mouse out, like so. And essentially we're going to be duplicating this down here. Now I'll refactor the code later so that we don't have duplicate code. But for now, essentially that's what we want to do. We want to go back to the original size. So let's try this out. And there you go. Okay. So that's pretty cool. So what we've done so far is we've been able to have a div, we've applied some kind of behavior to it. So we've given it a background color, we've given it a default width and height, and then basically we're able to change the width and the height based on some events. Okay. But what I also want to do is I want to change the color. Alright, the background color on hover. So let's quickly do that. So we'll come in and I'm going to set this to yellow essentially. So FF0. Once again, I'll put this, and then lucky last, because we've got to reset this back, I'm going to set this back to #DDD. Right. So how's this going to look now? We come over and we now see, oh, so not only does it get bigger, but we get this yellow background. Okay. Now so far, none of this is overly special. You're like, okay, well, what's so cool about this? There's really nothing major about this. We're just modifying behavior on an element based on some events, but we're doing it using a directive. Okay. Now, what I don't like about this, and this is the one thing that I'm going to point out straight away, is that I don't like the fact that I have to go native element.style.width because if I go here, there's no IntelliSense that tells me that there's even a style.width here in any way. Okay, it just doesn't. It doesn't tell me that. So what we can do, and this is the recommended way of specifying a style behavior on this element, is we don't concern ourselves with fetching the property from native element. We can do what's referred to as a host binding, right? And this is very similar to a host listener. On a host listener, we're watching for event handlers. With a host binding, we're binding to specific style properties or just properties in general of the underlying DOM element. Okay, so instead of going el.nativeElement.style.background, we can come up here, and before we go up to the top here, we need to include host binding, right? But we can create another decorator called host binding, right? And inside of this, just say I want to get style.background, we can literally copy this in as a string, right? And have a property name. Here we'll say, for example, we'll go background color, and we'll specify as a string. Okay. So what we can easily do now is we can come in here, and instead of having all this, we just go background color, this dot background color equals that, and then down on this one we do the same. Like so. And lastly, this one down here. Cool. What this also takes away is, and we haven't got to testing yet, but basically it will take away having to bind up this native element with certain things. Now we can just set properties on this directive and we can actually test out what we think certain properties are going to be based on certain calls, right? So in the test, we can click on mouse over and we can confirm that the directive's background color property was actually set to this color. Okay? That's the kind of direction of where we're going. So let's just quickly check to make sure that this is working. So we come back over and we can see it's still gray, right? We hover over, it's still yellow. We come back, it's still gray. So that host property is working. Okay, so that's cool. So let's go and change it for all these other ones that we've got here. So I'm going to come up and I'm going to create two more under here, like so, and we'll call them, in fact, host binding. Yeah, we need style.width, like so, and then we're going to specify the width in pixels. So you can also specify, as part of the host binding, the type of value you're going to put in there. So for this case, we can have element height, or we can just put width is the name here, and we can make it a number. Okay. Or we could have kept it, actually we'll keep it as a string. Okay. And because we can have the px, and then style.width, so this will be called height, and it's a string, and we'll make it not width.pixel but height.pixel, like so. And now we can come in and we can go this.width _width is equal to that, and this _height equal to that. And now you're starting to see it looks a lot cleaner to look at too, because we're not having to reference some EF. Okay, so there's this .width and then this .height, and just to make things look the same as the previous method, we'll put the background color first, and the same here, we'll put the background color first, just because the constructor has the background color first and the width and height. So we'll do the same, just keep it consistent. And in fact, we'll grab these two. Alright. So this is all a slow build just to get you to understand the kind of things you can do with directives and how you can bind certain things. So now what we should get is the same behavior we had before, but now we have these properties, all these bindings. Now these probably unexposed, or they shouldn't be exposed to the outside world. We probably should put a private in front of it. But I think if you put private in front of it, it can't bind to the actual physical property. But basically this is the concept of basically binding two styles. So we got an error here. What have we done wrong? I think the issue here could be the fact that because we set pixel, we don't need the px anymore. So this should probably now become 200, 300, 300, also 200. So if I come back now, and now it's working as before. That's cool. So we're slowly getting there. There's still a few things to cover that we need to focus on here for this to be complete. Now, the other thing we can think about is with directives, at the moment, you can see that we've hard-coded all these values by default. But some of these things might want to be inputs, just like it would be with an Angular component, right? You want to have an input, and you're like, okay, if we have an input, then we should be assigning that input to the right value, right? So that's what we're going to do. We're going to add inputs. Now we've seen inputs before, nothing new here. I don't have to explain what an input is. You should know this already. It's the same for directives as it is for components. It's even bound at the same time. After ng changes, ng on changes, it's the same spot essentially. Now, what I do for the input is I'm going to have the name here, and I'm going to set this as the default background, or not default. What should I call it? We'll just call it background color. Like so, okay? And we'll make it a string. And we'll come in here and we'll go background. No, we'll give it a better name. We'll go fancy background color. Like that. And we'll go for the name. We'll go input background color, or we'll just call it it's tough because you've got the input, which needs to be the same similar name to the actual binding here. Well, I'll go with fancy background color, like so. And then not in the constructor, because you got to remember the constructor evaluates things before you get the input. The input happens, you've got your ng on changes, and that's where the inputs first go in. However, for this example, I'm going to put things inside of on init. Now, if people remember on init, exactly the same behavior for directives. You pretty much initialize stuff, right? So I'm going to put under the constructor, I'm going to put ng on init. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove half of this stuff, and I'm going to put it inside the init, okay? Before I do that, I'm just going to paste that there. I'm going to grab this, I'm going to cut it, and I'm going to paste it here. The reason why I put under ng on init is because I really want these things to be applied when we're initializing the directive, not when we're first creating it, okay? When we're first creating it, we should have pretty much blank everything unless we specify values ourselves, right? So ng on init would be a good opportunity to change the information if we can, okay? And that's the thing here. So the fancy background color, as much as this is an input, this input may not ever exist, okay? So this is how we're going to have to write this. So I'm going to come up here, we go, this dot background color is equal to that. Now if this has something, we'll use it, right? Otherwise, we're just going to use DDD. Now the bit I forgot to add here is the this in front of it. So what I'm saying here is, if somebody's inputted a background color for this fancy div, use that color. Otherwise, use the default color. Okay. So let's see how that works. And the other thing that I'll probably have to do down here is the same thing. So grab the same line of code, and down here, it's pretty much a paste job for the moment. We will refactor this at the end. So save that. So we come back over, and nothing should be any different because we haven't actually set the input yet. Okay. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to set this div to black. Okay. I'm going to set it to black. Now the text should disappear, and that's what we're hoping for. So we know that our directive is working. So I'm going to come up to the component. We've called this fancy background color. I'm going to come up to the component. I'm going to create a new attribute here, like so. And inside of this, I'm just going to specify the value. So fancy background color, I'm going to set it to #000. And so this will set the input to #000, which is black, which means the overall div will be black. Let's check that out. And there you go, right? It's fully black. So we've created input for our directive. But sometimes, what if we just wanted to say, you know, when somebody specifies a fancy div, we can specify the background as the value of this attribute or this directive. You know, so how do we go about saying, you know what, we'll do this instead, like this. Okay, that's the kind of way we want. We want the default value of the directive to always specify a background color. Now, if we leave it out, it's fine. It just won't be included as an input. But if we add it in, we're going to have it as a default input that points to the background color. So we can do this. And how this is done is we come over and we've got fancy background color. We can come in here and just now put fancy div. Okay, so we just put fancy div here and save. And we come over. And once again, you'll see it's black. You know, nothing's changed, which is what we expect. Cool. So far, so good. Basically, what I want to address now for the remainder of this video is we're just going to basically fill in the rest of these properties, as well as add one for text color. So we're going to add another host button for text color, and then we're basically going to map all these things together. So this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to come in here, I'm going to copy this. I'll do this very, very quickly, as quickly as I can. Style.color, like so, and we'll set that to text color. Right, down here, we'll go this dot underscore text color is equal to this dot, we'll go fancy text color, or this dot fancy text color. Otherwise, we'll give it a default of, we'll keep it black. Right. That's the default behavior if we don't specify, and this should be same as that. And then we'll come up here, we'll quickly grab this, and I'll go fancy text color, and we'll copy that, we'll put that here, like so. So by default, we're making sure the text color inside the div is going to be black, and then we'll come to on mouse over, and we have it as currently you know, a yellow color, so we'll make sure it stays black. So we'll ensure it's black for the moment, and I'll go through the hover states in a moment. And then once again, we'll come down to this dot text color, and we'll grab that same code as up there. And hopefully now, you know, if I come up and on startup, maybe we can set the color to white. So what did I name this thing? I named it fancy text color. Hopefully you guys can follow along with this. So fancy text color, we go #FFF. So now we're seeing a black, so this is the default state. We're setting a black div with white text. And then when we hover over it, we'll have yellow background with black text. So there we go. So we're starting to get some behavior here that, you know, looks a little bit interesting, I guess. And mind you, this is not meant to be an exciting animation or anything like that, because animations handle a little bit differently in Angular 2. I'm just showing you what you can do. And now for the width, we might set another input up here. And for this input, we'll call it fancy side length, like so. And we'll call it fancy side length. Yep. Basically, if this is not set, so this dot fancy side length, right? We'll come in and we will set what we're doing. We are going to set this dot fancy side length. Whoops. Otherwise, the default is 200. Right. And for this dot height, because it's a square, we'll just go to this dot underscore width. There's no reason to say the same complicated line twice. And I'll do the same down here, like so. So now I can come up to fancy side length, and we can go to our app component, and I can specify a new attribute for that. And we can say I want it to be 400. Okay. So we come in, and as you can see, the div has gotten a little bit wider. We haven't quite handled the what happens when you hover over it yet, because we've hard coded in the values, right? We've got a value of 300, so it's actually going backwards. But what we really wanted to do is we wanted to increment by the amount, right? And so what I'm going to do here, I'm going to go plus equals 300 or 100, like so. Whoops. And this should hopefully fix that issue for the moment. So refresh. And it's not. I remember seeing this last time when I worked on it. Because this is a string, and we're trying to add the string to it, we really need to convert this to a number. So I remember how this worked. So this, the width is equal to, so it was a number of this dot underscore width. Alright, so plus 100. Alright, and we'll do the same. Plus 100, we'll change this to height. And then for all of this, we go toString. Like so. That means now we've aggregated whatever is currently in there plus 100, okay? And then go back over, and now I've got that 100, that 100 extra pixels shown there. And when we roll away, we go back to the original size. So that's cool. Now, we still have a lot of these default values in here, these hard-coded values. I'm going to fix that last, okay, because really that's just default data that we can just add as constants, okay. In fact, I've got a constant up here already. Now, in terms of, the other thing I haven't done yet either is set the background color, I believe. I've still got that hard-coded here. So we just need to quickly create another background color here. In fact, we need 2 more for the hover of both the background color and the text color. So hover background color, hover text color, fancy hover background color, fancy hover text color. So what I'm going to do down here on the mouse over is we're going to check to see if these things were populated. Because if they weren't populated, we don't want the value to change. Okay, we want it to be whatever it was before. So unless we want to specify a default, which I doubt we want to do that. Basically, if they specify a different hover color, we want to change that color. Otherwise, just keep the color as it was. So if we go if fancy hover color, yep, background color, so this dot that. So if we have a value, set the value. Alright, so we're going to set it to whatever is inside of that input. Okay. And then we're going to do the same for text color. Like so. So this goes this dot text color. Whoops. Fancy text. Fancy hover text color. Like so. And we'll do a check there as well. So by rights, if I run it now, the yellow should have gone away, and same as the text going black, simply because we haven't specified as attributes. So if only I come in here, we see that nothing changes because we haven't specified any hover color for the background or the text. So let's do that. So let's come back up. We're going to grab the fancy hover background color. And we can see we're starting to probably go on to the next line now. Like so. And this is the background color. So for that we went #FF0. And then for the text color, which is just the background replaced with text, we're going to go with black. I believe it was black. Yeah, it's definitely black, I'm sure of it. So coming over, so I've still got the black background, white text, and now we've got the yellow with the black text, and everything now is starting to look pretty darn cool. Right? We've got our host bindings where we're actually binding to the properties of the div. We've got our inputs that have come in from a component or just some file that has access to this directive, which would probably be a component pretty much. One thing we're not utilizing anymore, if you haven't noticed, in all this code, is we're no longer referencing the EL anywhere. You're like, okay, well, what's the point of having the EL anymore? Well, EL can be useful for when you want to transform maybe, some of the elements that are inside of that element. So say this is the parent element, and you might want to add some extra text, or you might want to clear out the text for that element. You need to be able to do this, right? So the way to do this, or the way I can show this potentially, is that when we hover over, we'll change the text. We'll change it from fancy div and we'll say maybe say hello world, and then when we hover out, we'll have fancy div again. Okay, so let's go about doing that. So on hover down here, we can go this.el.nativeElement.inner HTML equals what did we say we're going to call it? Hello world. Hello world. Okay. And then on hover out, we can do something very similar to that. Instead of hello world, we'll go back to, what do we call it? Fancy div. Okay. This is one way of doing it. So if I now come over, let it refresh, you can see hello world, fancy div, hello world, fancy div. Alright. The problem is, once again, we've got this, we're calling properties on something that is any, and it's going to be very hard to mock. Well, not hard to mock it out, but it's not the best thing to mock out. Okay, to mock out an element ref with native element, which is just kind of any object, and then we're specifying a thing. Plus, not only that, we have the concern of creating type non-type issues. This is dynamic now instead of static, or typed. It's not typed. Essentially, like this is typed, this we know is a string. When this is an any, it means any object, which means we can manipulate it in any way and type anything after this that we want, and not until runtime where we know that this actually breaks. Okay. So how do we get around this particular problem? Okay. Well, what I'm about to suggest isn't exactly, it's still experimental. Based on what I've read about this, it's not something that's like fully supported, I guess is the term. But basically what it is, it's this concept of a renderer. So renderer, like so. And this renderer is essentially like a service that allows us to do certain things to DOM elements. Okay, so in this case, the native, where is it? Where's the code that we had for the native part? Yeah, yep. So now, instead of using this, we actually include a new service as well. So private, and we'll call it, we just called it renderer, so I'll just call it renderer up here, or here, which is a type of renderer, like so. And instead of going this.el.nativeElement.inHTML is fancy div, we can now go this.renderer what did I call it last time in my example? We go set element property. Right, we pass in the this.el.native element, which at this point can be anything, and then we just give the name of the particular property that we want to modify. So in this case, it will be the inner HTML, and then we can set the value to whatever it wants to be, which in our case we want it to be none. Okay. Now underneath that, we don't necessarily need to set this the same way. We can come in here and go this dot renderer dot create text, like so. Oops, create text. Right, we can pass in this dot el dot naive element, and then we can pass in whatever text we want, which in this case is fancy div. And this allows us to abstract away the fact that we can use a service now instead of using some element reference object that had an any object on it. We can now literally call a proper method and check to see if that method gets called that way. So we now can say, is this code calling a renderer with this method, passing in some element, but we're also checking to see if the inner HTML is set to blank. we can test these things now. But I haven't got to test it at this point, but I'm just doing this ahead of time. So this by rights now should go and create a text fancy div. But before we do that, let's go and modify the one up here. So again, we need to pretty much do the same thing as we have down here for this line, like so. So now we have to set it to blank and then call it fancy div. And by rights, that should now change the text correctly on hover and stuff. In fact, it doesn't. It still says fancy div. So what did I do wrong? I left it as fancy div. Yes. So this should say hello world, like so. And now it says hello world. Alright. That's not too bad. I mean, that's pretty cool. And the code isn't too hard to understand, and we've done a fair bit of stuff here. Okay. Now, to be honest with you, I could pretty much end the video here, because the rest of what I have done for this particular video is I've basically just created constants, and I've replaced all these hard-coded areas with constants, you know, setting defaults. And this is in the GitHub repo anyway. You will see that I've replaced it with constants. But in terms of what you needed to know, or what you can learn from this is essentially it. Okay, this is a pretty fully fledged directive, and the end result is it doesn't do much, right? It's just that. But all the things you need to know about, such as inputs, such as host bindings, you know, we've got host listeners where we can act on certain events. We've got the concept of an ElementRef, which is the current element we're referring to, right? We have this concept of a renderer, which allows us to use or manipulate the DOM using service rather than trying to mock up a native element behind the scenes. What else have we looked at in here? We've used onInit to initialize a few things instead of using the constructor. And that's pretty much it. The only other thing that I'll quickly mention, and I should mention here straight away, and I'll do it for one property only, but basically if I put square brackets around this, remember attribute binding, right? It's the same deal with directives. So at the moment here, we've got fancy div. I've just put square brackets around it. So this is now a binding. This is not a property on the component. So if I go and save this now and then I try and load it, you're going to see things don't work. Okay. So if I come over and I look at the console, you get a whole bunch of crappy errors. Okay. You're like, oh, well, that's not right because that's an attribute and this is not a property on the component. So let's go and create a property on the component. Let's call it fancy div background color. Okay. Let's call it that. And then we'll come into the component.ts file. And inside of here we'll go fancy div background color. And we'll just make it equal straight to that value there. Okay. So now this should work. As you can see, it does. Okay. I thought there was a bug there for a minute. I'm not sure what was going on. It could have been just me flicking through this quickly. It looked like there was a bug, but just quickly refresh. See. Nah, seems to be fine. Okay, and that's it, guys. That's pretty comprehensive look at attribute directives. There's really nothing else to them than that. You know, just keep in mind that, well, there will be other things, obviously, when you try and build your own directives. You may have to look at different events. You may have to manipulate the DOM in different ways and that kind of stuff. But other than that, you know, this is a pretty good example of how to do it. Okay, so thank you everybody for listening, and I'll see you in the next video where I might look at the lifecycle hooks for directives first, and then we'll move on to pipes. So I'll see you then.